Welcome to our seminar, Warring for Truth, about how to have the courage and skills to fight misinformation and disinformation and defend the public's right to know. This American University Science Seminar is the third in a series aimed at empowering truth at a moment in our nation when truth is in trouble. Over the next hour, we will hear a story, consider data, take a poll, look at how to overcome deception, and hear from two journalists warring for truth: veteran White House correspondent April Ryan and investigative reporter Nathan Baca. We will also take your questions via the Q&A tab on your screens. Along with this seminar's co-producers Chanel Shaldana and Allison Wiseman, I hope you discover something that is useful to you. Okay, before we get started, a small window on why this fight matters. Genocide should never again go unreported, but it was a fight to get news managers to greenlight my reporting about the then little-known genocide in Darfur. It took years before they finally said yes. A few days before my first reporting trip, a fellow reporter dropped by my office and said I was brave to go. Surprised, I told him the militias unleashed by the government of Sudan were targeting African tribes people, not US journalists. But then he said, "No, I mean you are brave to risk your career because people don't care what's happening in Africa." On one of 8 trips to the region, I had just turned to walk into a refugee camp full of survivors, the sun at my back, when suddenly I saw a boy fall to his knees, looking up at me. Unlike him, I was well-fed and dressed in a clean white shirt. In his eyes, there seemed an unspoken horror, and instinctively I raised my camera and took this photograph. Guilt immediately overwhelmed me. How could I have taken something from someone so vulnerable? I was ashamed. Then a man walked up and said, "Thank you for taking his picture. Thank you for being here and taking our pictures. Now the world will know we exist." Truth is what can connect us. So when we are faced with misinformation and propaganda, what are we to do? Yes, an explosion of misinformation and disinformation has overwhelmed even our ability to fully measure it, but we can all see its impact. One poll conducted just this past December by the research firm Ipsos for NPR found 40% of those surveyed believed that coronavirus was created in a lab in China, which is not verifiably true. 53% could not identify as clearly false the statement that a group of Satan-worshiping elites who run a child sex ring are trying to control our politics and media, which is not verifiably true. And 39% agreed that a deep state was working to undermine former President Trump, which was not verifiably true. Most of us can likely list those we feel are responsible for the misinforming of America. Some of us might include people who call themselves journalists, along with propagandists, politicians, bots, and cable news opinionators, among others. But should we consider also including ourselves? Just as the old phrase tells us, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on, data researchers at MIT in 2018 found that false claims were 70% more likely to be tweeted than truth, allowing misinformation to travel farther and faster. They found, for example, that it took true stories about 6 times longer than false stories to reach 1,500 people. Perhaps it's time we confronted our own vulnerabilities to being more engaged with and influenced by what's sensational, outrageous, and likely inaccurate than we are by what's thoughtful, reasonable, and more likely accurate. It is this vulnerability that media companies pressure journalists to satisfy for ratings and circulations, and that social media and search engines use algorithms to mine and escalate to maximize clicks and therefore profits. Is it really any wonder that we are a nation inflamed? What do you think we can begin to do about it? For the purposes of this seminar, let me take this poll. Do you believe social media companies should do more to restrict users from sharing misinformation and disinformation on their platforms? Yes or no? It's going to take a minute for us to get this finding. So we'll just take a little pause. Um, 95% of you said yes, and 5% of you said no. All right, let me ask one more question. Do you believe the national news media fights hard enough to tell the truth about what is happening in America? Yes or no? And we're going to take a minute to wait for your response. Thanks for your patience. It's a miracle that we can cut. Okay, we have 31% saying yes and 69% saying no. No, I don't bring up these questions to convince you of something, but rather to get you thinking about solutions. And I really thank you for joining us in this poll. And I think one of the solutions we should probably consider or think about is based on this question. Do all of us have a responsibility, for example, to more carefully check our sources of information before we amplify it? Make no mistake, this war over truth is more than about the politics of our day, and more even than about science versus conspiracy theories during a worldwide pandemic. Access to truth can be a matter of life or death, as it has been throughout human history. This is a war about our future, which is why more people are stepping up. Fact-checking is on the rise even as I speak. Just this past weekend, fact-checkers, including at USA Today, PolitiFact, and AFP, outed as false claims suddenly circulating online that the COVID-19 relief package, including that a lot of claims, including that it includes bonuses from members of the House of Representatives, which it does not. Duke University Center for Journalism says that the number of fact-checking organizations has in fact risen 200% worldwide since 2016. The New York Times even has a daily distortions page tracking viral misinformation. Journalists must step up more to meet the challenge. We need to be smarter, braver, and bolder, and push to investigate information before reporting it and expose misinformation and disinformation. Some journalists already are. Consider, for example, investigative reporter Nathan Baca, whose work to verify whether the Catholic Church was doing what it said it would to screen out potential abusers from a seminary in Ohio. We have a clip now, a short one via WBNS.
We asked to see the specific proposal to create a seminary and tracking database and repeated calls and emails to the Josephinum and U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We received no details other than the Catholic Bishops' Conference stating they received what they call a letter of inquiry from the Josephinum. Neither group is saying what safety improvements, if any, the letter of inquiry proposes. The Josephinum did pledge in March to immediately fix problems resulting in anybody able to use the Josephinum's own network to access any websites, including pornographic images, without any security challenge. 10 Investigates tested the security again earlier today. The Josephinum's network remains unsecured. Since the Josephinum declined to answer our questions, we found the head of the seminary where he was having lunch and asked him some questions. What assurances can you give that this process will be in place as soon as possible for the applications coming in now?
It is in process. Look at our website. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Very good.
We looked at the Josephinum's website as the Monsignor suggested the day after, May 5th. Nothing was posted on the website about database proposals. The Josephinum did post a short statement claiming they sent a proposal to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to create a seminary and database. It was posted May 6th, 2 days after the Monsignor's comment, despite the posting showing the date May 4th.
Nathan also covered the protest near Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. on June 1st, 2020, at the height of outcry in the nation over the death of George Floyd. The BLM protesters were forcibly removed to make way for the then president to walk to a church where he held up a Bible. But authorities said that tear gas was never used. We have a clip now of Nathan's reporting via WUSA 9.
Watch out!
We witnessed canisters venting out green-colored gas. After watching the line of U.S. Park Police and Secret Service march south on 17th Street past us, we went back to the intersection on Ancient 17th where we found canisters scattered on the street. You can see me holding one looking towards the new protective line where a block away, President Trump was visiting St. John's Episcopal Church. I took one canister labeled as holding OC gas pellets. I handed WUSA 9's Darren Haynes a canister labeled as holding CS projectiles. Thursday morning, after denials from the White House and federal agencies that any tear gas was used, we discovered what that speed heat CS label meant. Artificial tear gas was inside. We showed our canisters to military bomb disposal expert Brian Kastner, now with Amnesty International.
That speed heat one, it's a cartridge that has a little bit of propellant in the back. It's got a bunch of tear gas up front, and you fire it from a launcher, and so it goes a certain distance. I believe that one's rated out to about 150 yards, so it goes fairly far. And its job is to spread tear gas around a crowd.
The gas we ran through Monday made me cry, and you can hear its effects on WUSA 9 photojournalist Baca. And to answer some viewer questions we received online, the 4 canisters gathered were not from a previous day. They were in the middle of the street, undisturbed, and in one case, still slightly warm to the touch. And our WUSA 9 crew were the first people immediately after police pushed south on 17th to get back to the H Street intersection. So who fired these canisters? U.S. Park Police says not them, issuing a statement. USPP officers and other assisting law enforcement partners did not use tear gas or OC scat shells to close the area at Lafayette Park. Neither protesters or our crews witnessed D.C. National Guard lead Lafayette Park during the protest. Arlington Police, who assisted them on 16th Street, denies using canisters. D.C. Metro Police denies assisting Park Police Monday at Lafayette Park at all. And the U.S. Secret Service denied using any gas or spray Monday in a statement to WUSA 9 Thursday evening. But federal law enforcement did launch tear gas Monday evening outside Lafayette Park. We watched them do it. We suffered the effects. We picked up evidence. We are pressing for answers.
Investigative reporter WUSA's Nathan Baca now joins us. Nathan, thank you enormously for joining us.
My pleasure, Ann.
Yeah. When confronting powerful institutions, in this case, in these cases, the Catholic Church, the White House, law enforcement, what above all else pushes you to struggle to verify what is true and what is not?
You know,
It comes down to, in many cases, what is self-evident, especially when it came to the tear gas. We had just experienced something that had happened to thousands of people that had been broadcast around the world. And we thankfully have the situational awareness of the time, which was difficult considering what you saw our crew was going through, coughing and tearing up, to figure out where we were in that time and place, and then to get back to the scene of what happened, and then to be able to gather evidence before it was cleaned up. And what was surprising, so surprising to us afterwards, was that despite this happening and broadcast all over the world, there were people, whether it was the agencies or whether or not it was so-called partisan journalists, who were saying that didn't happen. Tear gas was not deployed. And honestly, we had picked up those canisters, I dare say, almost as souvenirs of what had happened to us, never thinking that something that was so self-evident would be denied by multiple groups of people, whether it be the agencies that had the vested interest saying, no, we didn't do it, or whether or not it was groups that were defending a political ideology. It was honestly surprising to us.
Right. So it's really, there's a quote from Martha Gellhorn, a great foreign correspondent, who said, get it on the record, because journalism is a first draft, of a kind of rough draft of history. And if you don't verify, then it never happened. And you're talking about that, and it's almost chilling to hear you talk about. But, beyond the specifics, changes have happened. In other words, for example, in the case of the Catholic Church story, my understanding is that your reporting contributed to the Catholic Church changing its national policies in terms of how it screens for potential abusers. Is that correct? And is that your aim? Is change your aim?
Yes, in many cases, because the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did change their admissions policies and their admissions scrutinies after we highlighted that. And regarding evidence, it's a lot of assumptions happen, and especially when it came to that story, there were assumptions by the Catholic seminary there that they had secured their system. Everything was okay, but as we demonstrated just driving around the seminary, their Wi-Fi networks were just completely exposed and you could search up anything, as you saw pornographic images searched on their own computer. And this is after one of their own seminarians had been arrested for trying to go to Tijuana to pick up a child for sex in a human trafficking scenario. So in that situation, it comes down to just trying to understand that you've got to you have to go beyond the assumptions and really get to what the truth on the ground level is.
Well, let's go into that some more. We're now joined by former communications student Shira Turchinsky and current journalism student Cami Pine, who also have questions for you. Shira, what's your question or comment?
Hi, how are you? First of all, I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored to be welcomed back to the virtual campus for this moment. My first question, going back to where we started before, how you were feeling when the tear gas, when you saw it and when your crew was with it. How did you personally react to the tear gas that was dispelled at the peaceful protesters? And in that moment, what did you think it would mean for your reporting, and how critical it would be for your reporting when you saw it?
Yeah, in many aspects, and this is something for any aspiring journalist, like trust your crew and trust the fellow journalists around you. I mean, you have a team. Hopefully, there are many cases where you are sent out on your own, whether it be in television as a one-man band or whether or not as a print reporter. But if you do work within a team, form that cohesive unit and watch each other's back. Because we had that group at that time, actually, of 4 people, because we also had a security person as well. We also had, as you saw, our sports anchor, Darren Haynes for WUSA 9, who, we were just throwing bodies into that situation, just trying to get as many eyes on the ground. And then the photojournalist I work with, Rebecca Nair. And so in those type of situations, have to have that situational awareness, almost like a sports player on a field. Like you hear about football players and having how well they have situational awareness.
That holds true for journalism as well. Once you're on the ground, the best laid data and analysis and the like really comes down to what your senses are experiencing, and then to also trust what your fellow crew members are seeing, hearing, and just feeling as well.
Of course.
Cami, what is your question or comment?
Yeah, Nathan, it's so wonderful to have you here. As an investigative journalist myself, I'm wondering how to approach these reports where a person or an organization denies the truth, even when they are confronted with the evidence.
It can be difficult, and especially what you saw with the Pontifical College Josephinum, and being able to, at times, you have to find the opportunity to find that person face to face and ask them a question. Many times, they won't give you the answer, but the evidence that you've collected will then weigh in after the fact and say, yeah, this Pontifical College Josephinum rector said this, but the evidence on their own website clearly shows otherwise. So then at times it comes down to the art of the confrontational interview, and giving somebody as much opportunity as possible to talk to you, whether it be through an interview or even a statement. But there are times where it just comes down to, this person is stonewalling you and you need to find them face to face. And we just happen to find that person at their favorite Italian restaurant.
Yeah, and you did. What I also noticed is in the clip that we looked at, you were extremely, I thought, respectful. I mean, it was an important, I think he was a Monsignor and you were being respectful, but nevertheless persistent. I think that's an interesting mix, and it's one that's, I'm going to ask Shira and Cami I'm going to thank you first of all for your great questions. Maybe we'll bring you back in a little bit. And Nathan, I'm going to also put a pause on you because I'm looking at the time and I would like to get to our next guest. Are you free, by the way, to come back after this next interview for more questions from the audience listening and from students?
Definitely, I'd love to take any questions.
Fantastic. So we'll say goodbye to you for now. We'll see you in a few minutes. I want to turn though to our next guest, because the truth is particularly hard won in political reporting, and nowhere are the stakes higher than in Washington, D.C. And for 24 years, White House correspondent April Ryan has questioned U.S. presidents, as we see in this clip via C-SPAN.
President, for many years, civil rights leaders have called for White House help on cases of police brutality and police profiling.
April.
Mr. President, two questions. One on energy and another on SPAN.
On what?
Not energy, I'm sorry, the economy.
April, go ahead, April.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Last question, I guess.
Yes. I know this is going to be a bad question, but that's okay. Because I enjoy watching you television. Okay?
Well, thank you so much. Mr. President, I need to find out from you.
April Ryan now joins us. She reports on the Biden White House currently. And April, it's such an honor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ann.
It is not easy to question any president, not to mention one who publicly ridiculed and discredited you as President Trump did. You received death threats during his administration, and yet you still persisted, just as you had always. What drives you to hold presidents accountable through the years, in spite of everything, April?
Well, I attended college for this profession. I was a trained journalist through Morgan State University. And I learned that I can ask the who's, what's, when's, where's, and why's. And I did. The founding fathers put in place something called the First Amendment that deals with freedom of the press. And I am free to ask a sitting president anything from war to peace and everything in between. And it's up to them to say, no, I'm not going to answer. But I have the right, the constitutional right, to ask those questions. And why did I stay? Because I did nothing wrong. What I asked were questions that people wanted answers to, questions that certain communities wanted answers to. And if I would have walked away, Ann, I would have let my late parents down. They worked so hard for me to be in the profession that I enjoyed. I didn't come from a silver spoon. I came from a working class family. And I understand that I stand on the shoulders of so many when I go in that room and ask questions. So I never did anything wrong. So why should I walk away?
My father had a phrase, you know, when I would be scared about asking somebody very important, tough questions, and they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do, you know, and he used to say, you know, and you know what an expert is? An X is a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure. It kind of really helped me with my thinking about it. But it's different when you're looking at the President of the United States. And I'm sure that that's really tested these things for my father. And also as the only African-American reporter in the room, oftentimes, you persisted in asking questions about race when other reporters did not. So what drives you to keep race on the front burner, even when it means being the only one standing alone?
Well, one, I work for companies that focus in on the communities that are underserved, disenfranchised, et cetera, et cetera. But it is daunting to be the only one asking questions on a community that's still underserved. In 2021, we're still a community with the highest numbers of negatives in almost every category. And a lot of times, if I wouldn't ask those questions, they would not be asked. And like yesterday, I think of yesterday, and just yesterday, think of this. This is not myth. This is not conjecture. This is fact. The COVID numbers. There was a press conference call on a study by Brilliant Corners, Democratic pollster Cornell Belcher, talking about the hesitancy of African Americans to take the vaccine. The numbers are stark. These are numbers from the CDC. 13 million white Americans have been fully vaccinated compared to 1.3 million African Americans. That number is stark, vastly different, polar opposites. Now, why? And when you ask those questions, you get to the base of why, and a lot of times when you ask questions, it changes a dynamic or it can help a community. So as a first line of questioning of an American president, a lot of times race was never on the table, but it's always on the table. Mm-hmm. It's a community, the Black community is still a community with water that's unsafe, has dealt with policing issues from the enslavement of Africans in this nation 401 years ago. It's a community that is not being vaccinated at the tune of others in this country. It's a community that is devastated and has been devastated by socioeconomic problems. And who else would I ask how to change the dynamic than the President of the United States of America for his citizens that don't normally get answers to questions.
So April, we have a panel of working student journalists now joining us with questions, including Desiree Coombe, a writer for Blackprint, Stephanie Mira, a staff writer for The Eagle, and Sophie Austin, the editor-in-chief at The Eagle. Let's start with Desiree. Desiree, what's your question or comment? Maybe Desimee's audio is not on. So I'll come back to you, Desiree. Stephanie, do you have a question or comment that you'd like to ask April?
I do. Thank you so much for being here today, April. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to ask you this question. So watching that clip of you talk to former President Donald Trump and seeing how he dismissed you and how he put such doubt into his supporters' minds about the news media. So I was wondering, do you believe there's hope for making people trust in the news media again? And to what extent is it individual networks' responsibility to regain that trust of people like QAnon supporters and extreme right-wing ideologists?
So for news networks, yes. The onus is to get the facts and to get it as right can be. We are human and there are mistakes. And we have to come back and say, you know, we have to correct the mistakes. But there's also an obscured line now between news and opinion and entertainment and news. The line has been obscured, and I believe it is important that news agencies, news organizations, news networks put disclaimers if need be, because it's a life or death situation, in my opinion, at this point. Sometimes we go out, I'm not saying me, but I'm doing a collective, we present ourselves as news, and we're actually entertaining, and we gin up a certain segment of society to react. Where does the blame fall? The blame not only falls on the person that's doing it, but on the network that allows it. I believe it is important, it's incumbent upon every journalist to get the facts. Again, we get it wrong, but I'm gonna tell you, sometimes we get it wrong, but we are the first group of people you look to when something is wrong, what's happening. You tune us in because you trust us. You tune in because you need the information. And I'm gonna give you an example of when we get it right, the beauty of when we get it right. I think about the dilemma on the Hill a couple of years ago, and Suzanne Malveaux had, she ran into someone in the elevator and had a real-time, with Senator Flake and some constituents, she had a real-time moment in the elevator where she was filming it and put it on television. And that moment being televised, that real-time moment, translated into a change in the Senate chamber. So we are human. Do we need to change some of our tactics? Yes. When it comes to that line that's obscured, we need to let people know if we are speaking fact and news, or if we're speaking opinion and entertainment. So I think we're dealing with a lot of different pieces. And I think that's some of the reason this obscuring of the line has helped to foster the mistrust in news.
I think you're right about that. Sophie, what is your question or comment?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and I'm grateful to be on the panel. So April, you've been a White House correspondent for over 2 decades, and I had a question for you regarding advice you have for young journalists to join the White House beat. So what advice do you have when it comes to developing sources when young journalists begin to cover the White House, especially when you're fighting against a press department that strives for consistent communication? And also, what advice do you have for researching the motivations of the sources that you speak with?
And I'm glad you put that last piece in. So you always have to remember, a White House is going to always give the information that they want you to have, supporting the president. But as they give you that information, you want to know all the W's, who's, what's, when's, where's, and why's, who was involved in creating this information, why did they formulate it, was there any other plan A, B, or C with it? You want to know everything about it. You want to know who the principals were engaged in, what the president thought about it. So a lot of times you will not get all of that information out of that singular place or just from the press secretary. So you have to have a working Rolodex. I believe my phone is one of the most priceless items in my contacts in my phone, one of the priceless items in Washington, because you don't just want to talk to the president or his staff, but you want to talk to those people who are outside the White House, who are helping to formulate the plan, to get more into the weeds of it, to dig deep into the story. And also community groups who are for or against it. You want to get all sides of the story, because it's not just their side. You have to remember, any White House will want to present their view. And we have called it spin. They want to spin it to their advantage and to their gain, but it's not just their way. It's so many sides to the story. So as a journalist, a young journalist coming into the White House, I would not just take what the White House says as the end of the story.
One of the parts of Sophie's question is the motives, to figuring out the motives. Is there any more that you can say about that? Like trying to understand beyond looking good?
So motives, it all depends on the moment. I mean, we've got colliding crises right now. And the White House, at this point, the motive, I want to look like I'm working, and they are. I'm working for the people, trying to fix this. But what if there's something that, one of those hidden variables that always fly up, and it hits you in the face. There is always a machine that is behind what is the advantage of saying this way? What is the disadvantage of saying this way? And I want to bring into this mix something that you can kind of understand. We all watched that Forever interview that's never going to die with Oprah and Meghan and Harry. And they were talking about the firm. And I think about the queen and the courtiers, if you will, the people who help her figure out what she can do, the motive. You know, what does it look like if we do it this way? What does the motive look like this way? If we do it that way, what does the motive look like there? That's the same at the White House. You know, there was a book and a movie, All the President's Men. It's not just the president, but people who in the spin room or his strategists and advisors who figure out if we do it this way, or they think they're figuring it out, it looks this way. There's always a motive behind something. To help, what does it do? I get more support for the next moment. I build momentum for the Democrats for 2022. I build more momentum to help my successor, if I don't want to run for president, to come in. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but you know, there's always a motive behind what is done in politics or even in London at the palace. So it kind of all comes together. The motives of, we are a reactionary group of people and they do it because something happens. So, okay, I have to do it, but what does it look like if I do it this way? What does it look like if I do it that way? There are always scenarios, plan A, plan B, plan C. I mean, there's always a thought process of even just to wear the color of a tie at a press conference. Everything is thought out. What signal does it send? What does it look like? What does it mean?
Right. So you really have to become extremely adept, as you are, April, at figuring out, trying to tease out all of those sort of hidden messages and motivations. I want to give Desiree another chance. Desiree, maybe your audio was turned off last time. Do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, April, for taking the time to speak with us. Nailing down the truth is a reporter's fundamental task, and it's one that proved exceptionally difficult with the Trump administration. So my question is, how can women journalists, particularly Black women, navigate fake news effectively amongst racially and gendered targeted?
Okay, so I'm not fake news. And if you want to give me a trigger word, that is one of my triggers, fake. I don't like it. Because that also went along with something that was very negative and deadly and dangerous as well, enemy of the people. So the narrative was created, but we have to continue to rise above it. What is unfortunate is it was smeared upon women like myself, Abby Phillip, Yamisha Sindor, Ouija, so many different, not just Black women, but minority women. And for me, I was one of the first at the White House because the thought was I worked for a boutique outfit who didn't really have that much support. So, oh, we can scare her. We can make her leave. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to make her leave. And if they created the narrative against me and made me leave, people would believe, oh, well, she must be what they say she is. And that's farthest from the case. But what I signed up for is different than what's happening today. When I was a student at Morgan State University learning the craft, I remembered people like Walter Cronkite. If you don't know who he is, Google him. He used to end his newscast saying, that's the way it was. It wasn't about party. It wasn't about your mindset or what you thought. It was about the story. And the unfortunate piece is now, as reporters, we are now the story. We're the ones who are supposed to be in the back of the room writing, scribing what happened. Now the spotlight is on me. And even though I'm out there, I'm really a shy person, believe it or not. It's hard to put yourself in front of the story. The story is supposed to be in front of you. And now you are in front of the story because you're singled out because someone does not want to talk about the issues that you ask questions about for a segment of society that is still hurting. You are targeted because of your race and your gender, to use you as an example. So today, I tell young minority women in particular, have a tough skin and do the work. Never let anyone write the narrative about you. I mean, look at what's happening to Taylor Lorenz over at the New York Times. It makes no sense. It makes no sense because she's talking about technology and now she's getting threats and unwanted attention. I tell young women and women of color to have a tough skin and never let anyone write your narrative. You have to speak out against it because if not, it could mean your career and it could mean your life. And I say that as someone who had to do that. So you have to keep doing the work. And at the end of the day, your work stands for you. You can call me all the names you want, but if you look at my articles and my videos, go to theGrio.com. You will see everything that I've written. I am not an enemy of the people. If anything, I'm writing about the people and for the people. So I think we have to really put it in perspective now. This is a different day. Being a journalist, you are under attack. I mean, I used to watch journalists as a kid years ago being under attack in different countries, never thinking it would be here. So we're in a different day. And I think we have to be armed with a tough skin, self-assurance, and writing our narrative and just doing the work.
You know, it really, it's very affecting to listen to you, April, because it speaks to how much journalists, and it's men, male journalists also take on a degree of threats as well in different contexts. But it's interesting, you know, you have to really believe that you are part of something that's important. I think that people who think about journalism as a career, as a business, are missing it, because ultimately it has to be really about the profession of seeking the truth, that being noble and enough so that you're willing to go through the physical pain and the struggle and even the death threats that you've gone through, April.
You know, it's bigger than me. It got to the point because, Anne, you know, I had to move my home. I had to protect my children. I had people coming to it's a lot that I can tell you. But I had to say, you know, I had a real serious talk with myself and my family, my aunts, because my parents are now transitioned this life, but we talked about it. And I said, you know, I don't know anything else and I didn't do anything wrong. And they prayed. I come from a family of prayer warriors and women that go to church and just, you know, they prayed. And I said, you know, I did nothing wrong. But at the end of the day, if I left, what message does it send to my two daughters? What message does it send to the Black community? What message does it send to my ancestors who are looking down? You know, the Ida B. Wells, you know, the Harry McAlpins. I mean, these are people who worked, Harry McAlpin, Alice Dunnigan, and Ethel Payne. They were transformative figures in Black press who worked at the White House decades ago in the midst of racism and hatred. What does it say? You know, Harry McAlpin, when he was a member of the White House press corps, he was told he wanted to go to a press conference, and he was told by the White House press corps, some of the white members of the press corps, because there weren't many Black people, if at all. He said, look, if you by any chance come into this press conference and you step on our shoes, there will be a riot. Hearing those kind of stories, I said, I gotta keep going. It becomes bigger than you. It's not about you. It's about a community that needs you to ask those questions.
And I would say that in America, and your point is well taken about the community that you report to for theGrio, and you're also an analyst, political analyst for CNN. There are communities across this country, and everyone across this country deserves to have the questions asked that will help them have a better life. And so that's the higher cause, I think, for all journalists. I want to tell Desiree and Stephanie and Sophie, thank you so much for your smart questions. We're going to open up to the questions from people who are listening and watching. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. And I know, April, you're going to stick around a little bit longer. So let me just say that before we keep moving, that our third seminar, Frontline Reporting About Surviving Dangerous Assignments, especially overseas, is precisely 2 weeks from today at noon on Tuesday, March 30th, which will then be followed by our final seminar on interviewing. We're going to now be rejoined by Nathan Baca, I hope, who will be here along with April Ryan to answer your questions until the top of the hour. And we're also joined by the seminar's co-producers, Allison Wiseman and Chanel Saldana, who've done a lot of work to put this class together. And they're going to help us now take your questions through the Q&A at the bottom of your screens. I'll also stick around past 1 o'clock if you have more questions, if we have a lot of questions. We want to thank April Ryan and Nathan Baca for sticking around. What are the questions, that you have in front of you, so Allison and Chanel?
Yeah, so this first question is from Megan, who's from CBS News in New York City. And they want to know, what do you say to critics who say the press corps isn't covering the Biden administration as critically as they were the Trump administration? And what does it say to you if the president hasn't done a press conference with reporters? And how has having Jen Psaki, the new press secretary, in the briefing room changed the dynamic of the room?
So let me say this, there are no personal attacks, at least from the press secretary to the press corps. That's one thing. The president, I said this Sunday on reliable sources on CNN, he needs to do a press conference. Yes, the president has, he's had interviews with so many different people, but we need to have a full-blown press conference with the full White House press corps that encompasses a statement, beginning with a statement, and then you take at least, beginning at least 10 to maybe 13 questions. When President Obama was there, he really expounded on things. It was kind of like 7 to 10 questions, but I've been in press conferences where there were like 13 or 14 questions. So I do believe, because when you have the entire press corps, you get a hodgepodge of questions from different areas versus just focused in on one area, because you've got questions that you may never hear from people that you don't get a chance to talk with in the briefing room, because right now in the midst of COVID, there's a different scheduling of reporters coming in and how they come in. Now, CBS, what's the first part of what CBS New York asked? Thank you, CBS New York.
It was, what do you say to critics who say the press corps isn't covering the Biden admin as critically as they were the Trump admin?
Well, I'm going to say this. You don't have the full press corps in that room, number one. And we're in the midst of colliding crises. You have to remember, a lot of Donald Trump was spectacle. We couldn't believe the things he said. It was entertaining and it was a spectacle. And you have people just writing, oh my gosh, this administration is taking a different approach. And there are stories for and against President Biden. So, but I think if we had the room like it used to be, full of reporters, I think you would get that feel. And right now, COVID has prevented, again, the full press corps from being in that room. That's one of the reasons why we need a press conference, because there's so many different questions, not just what the first row would say or the second row would say. There are so many different questions that this president needs to take. So I give them credit for having daily press briefings. During the Trump years, there were times we didn't have any. I give them credit to a certain extent, but we need more. we always need more access. So end of story. So there is a difference. There's a stark difference between the presidency of Donald John Trump and how we had to cover him. We had to cover him in real time. We had to fact check this president because some of the things he said were complete lies. You know, you had a president talking about Lysol and Clorox and an injection and a light. I don't believe you're going to hear anything like that from this president. I don't believe. But there's stark differences in their approaches to the press, how they delivered their message to the public. There's stark differences. So, but we are covering it. We're not going to see, I don't believe, the spectacle of Joe Biden that we saw with Donald Trump. Joe Biden is different from Donald Trump. End of story.
Chanel, do you have another question?
I do, yes. This is from Shaheen, who is currently in Malaysia, but is a student at the University of Oregon. This is for Nathan and Anne. In regards to verifying facts without being able to be on the ground, how do you know what is accurate and what isn't? So in other words, do you have to be on the ground to get the truth and to get credible sourcing?
Nathan, why don't you take this?
It certainly helps to be on the ground because at the critical moments, right as something is happening, to be able to have that sense of like, I was eyewitness to that is very important. However, if you cannot be on the ground, then finding those people who were and who actually have that that eyewitness account is very important. It comes down to a journalistic organization in many aspects. How you can trust them does come down to boots on the ground. I always like to get my news from sources that have a lot of reporters who have knocked on doors, met people face to face, or in this time of COVID, at least being able to talk to folks on a one-on-one basis, because then you know that there are fewer filters that go through that. Of course, there'll be editorial filters, but to have that sense of just that ground level journalism can be extremely important.
Yeah, I think, Nathan, you're absolutely right. There are ways to gather data, and especially today, using the internet and other ways to gather information, phone calls. But the reality is that you're going to miss a lot of the nuance, and the nuances oftentimes are actually what really shows you the truth. That it's not this and this, but it's sort of all those shades in between that you're going to miss if you're not practicing good shoe leather reporting. So I think that there is a move away from shoe leather reporting. We're certainly seeing it as we heard from April a little bit about talking about what was going on in broadcasting especially, but it's also happening in newspapers where people are talking to people about what they think happened, but actually what we want to know is what actually happened. And so people's opinions shouldn't matter as much as actually getting the facts, which is what we see both Nathan and April work so hard to do. Why don't we go to another question, Allison?
Yes, this one's from Kylie, who is a law student at the Washington College of Law at AU. And they want to know, after the Alex Jones tweets about the lies of the Sandy Hook massacre, do you believe, and this is for both you and Nathan and April and Ann, do you believe that there should be legal requirements or damages imposed against so-called journalists who mislead their viewers and the readers? And should the actual malice requirement of the New York Times v. Sullivan case be imposed, where the culpability rests on knowingly misleading the viewers?
I mean, it's either I don't know if anybody would ever call Alex Jones a journalist. I don't know that he ever even called himself that, but this is a very interesting question. The journalists are considered the watchdogs, right? But who's watching what's happening today, and should there be a responsibility? Do you have an opinion about this, April?
I'm going to speak more broadly. I'm not going to speak to that case, but at the end of the day, the consumer is one of the watchdogs. We always said that, give us feedback, but the feedback has now gone to social media, and it has gotten there's such a visceral reaction to either news you don't like or news that's wrong, misleading, etc. And I don't want to name networks, but there are networks right now that are practicing the lessons of being misleading and giving false narratives. And it is not good because it sends us into a spiral that makes us look like other countries. You know, we are intelligent people. We are people who use critical thinking. And I do believe that there needs to be an understanding that we need to go back to what used to be, the facts. And there needs to be an understanding that when we put out what we put out, it's either factual, it's either opinion, I'm going back to what I said before, or it is entertainment. Too much is at stake. And I believe that our news organizations are our watchdog, our editors, etc. But there is also a consortium. We have people like some of our organizations, some of our news organizations that we kind of confer with that challenge what's wrong. And then there is the public. But I do not believe that we should be putting out knowingly put out misleading information. If we're led down the wrong road, that's one thing, but we should not be putting out misleading information because the stakes are too high. And it is now in this time, a life or death issue.
Yeah, that's not journalism. Nathan, you have an opinion about this? You want to?
Yeah, it's, I'd like to actually know a little bit more about the legal structure in the United Kingdom, because from my understanding in the United Kingdom, there is a slightly different bar when it comes to proving slander or libel. You do see a lot more lawsuits and therefore corrections. I think it's also interesting to note that what you're seeing with Dominion voting machines and the lawsuits that Dominion has either filed or threatened to file regarding some inaccurate reporting about its election machines. That'll be an interesting test case. Unfortunately, though, it kind of creates that situation where the only people that really can defend themselves against slander or libel are those massive corporations that can handle it. And therefore, what about just regular folks who see themselves being misled? I think we are going to have some sort of real deep look at the legal landscape. I mean, of course, when I do stories, many different stories are vetted by an attorney, and I actually welcome that, because I do want multiple sets of eyes, editors, attorneys, to look at that and to really challenge me on, okay, you say this, but what evidence and or legal liability do you what sort of legal options do you give the other side to be able to respond to it? And I want that challenge, and any journalist in many aspects should welcome that. What the problem is that there are too many outfits out there that that fly by the seat of their pants and don't welcome that sort of legal liability. They get so far ahead of themselves, and then you get these massive lawsuits that, you know, arguably can just taint the entire industry.
That's right.
Do we use the word alleged anymore?
I do. I try not to ever need to use it, but I do use it. You use it. Of course, we all use it, right?
Yeah, but I don't see it as much as I used to. There's more accusation and more finger pointing, and we're in a whole different day.
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Both of you are saying essentially we all need to step it up more, that we have to take better responsibility, that the bar, we are all part of this conversation is about raising the bar. And it's also about telling a new generation of ethical journalists that, that they have the challenges for them to also keep the bar high, that what they're seeing in so-called journalism today may not be, and to sort of know what it is and what it isn't. It is now almost 1 o'clock. I want to tell you, I know, April, you've got to leave at 1. So I want to thank you so much for the generosity that you've given these students in being here. Nathan, I hear you might stick around a little bit. So I'm so thrilled. I want to thank April Ryan and Nathan Baca for their talents and their fierceness in the war for truth, and for joining us. And we also want to thank the Sign Institute and American University for inviting me to teach. And we want to thank our student panelists, all of them, and our Empowering Truth team, which is led by Christina Barnes. And we want to thank you especially for attending this seminar and caring for truth. And we'll all see, all of you need to leave now. We'll see you again in 2 weeks, same time, same place. Meantime, bye, April. Thank you. And
thank you so much.
If you're able to stick around now, I think we're going to go back to more questions. And I think the next person, Chanel, I think you're up.
Sure. This next question is from Patty. She wants to know, how do you keep your opinion out of the questions that you ask and frame them objectively, especially on issues that are personal to you?
It can be challenging. You know, take, for instance, the Pontifical College Josephinum story, the Catholic Church story. I was born and raised a Catholic, and I always respected that institution in a sense, just because that's how I was raised. And yeah, I felt I was kind of able to speak the language, so to speak, you know what a Monsignor, know what a rector is, know that type of thing. And so it can be challenging at times to actually confront somebody with a question whenever you've either respected that sort of institution for a very long time, or in some aspects you don't. For instance, you know, I've done plenty of stories about the Church of Scientology. You rarely, if ever, hear, this is before like a lot of the documentaries came out. It was difficult in a sense to, on a kind of a personal note, to not just immediately label them a cult, because that's just what you hear and kind of like the parlance in a sense, because you have to take the questions in the sense of like, these are people with a religious faith, and I should be asking the same type of questions that I'd be asking a member of the Church of Scientology as I would ask any sort of religion. And you have to really like kind of gut check yourself in that sort of situation.
I think it's sometimes, I think I've sometimes failed to not have maybe a tone or a word that feels pejorative in my questions as I've interviewed people. But overall, I think I've done okay. I think that I think you can ask extremely tough questions respectfully and get very good answers. I think the hardest interview, which was one of the biggest challenges, was when I interviewed, going back to the story I told at the top of the hour, which was about Darfur. I interviewed the man who's accused of unleashing the genocide in Darfur, Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan. And I remember there were times in trying to ask him about it, I kind of pushed a little bit too much in terms of, you can kind of tell I'm saying, there was a kind of a sense of outrage in the questions. But overall, I think even in that one, which was a terrible challenge, a difficult challenge, I found that if you are able to be, even in that circumstance, respectful, and yet asking the tough questions respectfully, as we saw Nathan do as he talked to the Monsignor, oftentimes you're more likely to get an answer that is reportable. And I think so. It's really not about. It's about discipline, it's about practice. And one of the things I think about journalism is that you're never really actually perfect at it, because you're a human being and you're talking to human beings about stuff that's about human beings. And there are so many ways for things to be misunderstood and misdone, but you just keep practicing, you keep trying, and eventually you get pretty good at making less and less mistakes. That'd probably be my answer to that. What's your next question, Allison?
Yeah, so this question is actually my question, because I think it's a really good follow-up to this topic. So I'm also born and raised Catholic, raised in a Catholic household, still live in one. And how do you, when you're covering these stories, people get really offended when you ask these tough questions that call out their religion for something that they don't want to accept is happening, especially within the Catholic Church and all that goes on in our church, like with the news yesterday that came out from the Vatican and the Pope not supporting same-sex unions and marriage. So when you are reporting and covering this stuff, how do you anticipate, I guess, or handle the blowback that you get from people within your own community, your own religious community?
That's a challenging question in a sense, because by the time that I was doing the stories about Pontifical College Josephinum, I don't think I know, I identify myself in a sense as with a Catholic heritage, but I stopped attending Mass shortly, probably some years before. And it's religion and journalism are two very fascinating subjects, because on one hand, you have a subject that is based so much on let us find all the facts and verify them. And then religion being such a leap of faith and trying to search for the unknown. They are in some aspects opposed, but in some aspects, they have the same drive and require the same zeal. And so to answer your question, whereas I didn't face individual challenges of like people within my own faith community saying, you know, what are you doing? I can realize that it can be very challenging, because there is a, like Anne said, you know, we're human beings and we have to be able to also justify what we're doing in our questioning, as well as our own personal psychological health, if that makes any sense. So yes, I mean, there could probably be a whole other seminar about how religion and journalism can both work together, but also kind of drive each other apart. There are two siblings in a sense on philosophy.
I think to answer your question from the way I would do it, Allison, is I would just simply say that you have, as we heard from April, you have to, you don't become a journalist because you want to be popular. You don't become a journalist because you want everyone to like you or to friend you. You become a journalist because you love the truth and you're willing to fight for it, and you're willing to learn how to fight for it. And you just take what comes. The truth is that I think that you do your job. I actually was also raised Catholic, and I have reported on the Catholic Church. And I think that the key is to find, you know, if the truth is your North Star, finding the facts is your North Star, then you just do your job, and come what may. People will not appreciate what you're doing, and they may actually really disagree with what you're doing. But if you're doing it in an earnest manner, looking for truth, and you are doing it fairly in the sense that you are listening to all the data before trying to figure out the truth. Not that there are necessarily always two sides, but sometimes there are and sometimes they're not. But you're not going to find any kind of truth if you don't look at everything. So if you're doing this in an earnest manner, then I think people start to appreciate, okay, well, you know, don't agree with them, or I don't like them, or they can't believe that report that he or she did, but you know, I know that they're trying to to find the truth. And that kind of sense is what I've often gotten. I mean, I think it's why I've interviewed people who you would think would have said no, you know, over and over, you know, the president of Iran, the president of Syria, Assad, those, you know, why would they? Because they have a sense that you are going to be truthful, that your aim is high. And I think that's ultimately where you, in the end, that April can and Nathan can look back on their careers and said, I did my job. And that's really what it is. And the job has a noble purpose. It can have a noble purpose. It can be one of the most noble of tasks, to do something, to do work, to find truth when others think less of you or don't like what you're doing. That's actually what the job is. You know, as April talks about the difficulties for her personally, that you still do the job even though it's difficult because there's a higher purpose. That's nobility, and that's how this job can be done. It's not about being popular. It's not about being well liked. It's not about everybody in your group thinking you're great. That's not the job. Do you have a question, Chanel?
That was actually our last audience question. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Nathan, this has been really fun for me. You and I have never met, and I think for all of the students, it's been really great to see your work, your persistence in getting this. Do you want to say anything, Chanel? Because I know you were particularly impressed with Nathan's work.
Yeah, no, just really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today, particularly about those 2 clips and your reporting as a whole. So it's been a huge asset to our event today. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I'd be more than happy to send my email address in the chat or something like that. If anybody has any other questions, I can certainly answer them offline.
You're really great about that. Great. Thank you. Any final thoughts, Allison? No, you're good?
No, just thank you once again for agreeing to be here in April, even though I know she left, but y'all are both fantastic and your reporting has been just absolutely phenomenal. And I loved watching your videos. So thank you for coming to be with us today.
So Nathan, we're cheering you. Keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody who hung out with us to listen. Thank you. See you in a couple weeks. Bye, Nathan.